How's it going to work? Yes, I know it's being live streamed. I'm the one who did it. Tick tock, tick tock, tick tock. Oops, and it's unfortunately got the volume on, and I hate hearing myself. And we need to turn it so the comments can be made because it likes to change that. And there's the chat. Okay. Not that everybody uses the chat on anything like a frequent basis, but I like knowing that it's there just in case. All right, so we are picking up now in chapter 34 of the book of Bereshit, the book of Genesis, and we are in Vayishlach. And Vayishlach famously begins with the meeting up of Esau and Jacob, but we've talked about that many times. And now in chapter 34, once that has been finished, we move into the heartbreaking story of Dinah. Now, Dinah was the only named daughter of Jacob, and she is named, of course, explicitly because she plays a very important role in the story here of chapter 34. We are not going to start from the beginning of the chapter because we want to focus on the end. So let me just give you a brief summary of the text. The people that are with Jacob, his family, the people who work with him, they are all settling in an area near Shechem. Now that's a little confusing because Shechem is also the name of the main assailant in this story, but just try to keep that in mind. Unfortunately, this man Shechem casts his eyes on Dinah, and he takes her and he rapes her. Following this, there is a lot of obviously grief and great upset within the family of Jacob. And Shechem says, well, you know, actually, I'd like to marry her. So how can we come to an arrangement? Obviously, there's a lot that could be said about, well, is this like somehow going to make it better? Is this somehow wrong? We do know from other parts of the Torah, as well as other ancient texts, that marriage of a rape victim was occasionally accepted as a necessary evil, if you will. That since the woman might have diminished capacity to get married to someone else, and since the man may have thought that his violent assault would not yield much more than a short-term monetary fine or some other physical punishment, forcing him to be the caretaker, to actually be responsible for her well-being, which is what a husband was legally obligated to do in the ancient world, would create a possible deterrent or not, as the case may be, for these types of assaults. So it's not entirely bizarre that Shechem proposes to marry Dinah, but it's also, as I think we can all understand, very difficult to see how the family would have welcomed that. Indeed, they come back to him, the sons of Jacob, and say, well, tell you what we're going to do. And they basically lie. They say, well, you know, we'd be more than happy to let Dinah marry you, which is a lie, but you are not circumcised. And for our family, excuse me, for our family, circumcision is a requirement. So if you want to marry her and thus join with us, you and your entire city need to be circumcised. Excuse me, one more time. Just got one of those little feelings like there's something stuck in the throat, and see if I can't dislodge it before trying to continue. So the brothers of Dinah basically try to convince the people, well, Shechem and his father Hamor, to circumcise themselves and the city in order that they will then allow Dinah to marry him. Now, it should be pointed out that, as we'll see from the text, Dinah seems to have been still being held captive in the town. So we're going to talk a lot about the motivations and the intention behind the brothers' actions. But excuse me, see if that helps a little. But we have to bear in mind that she is being held hostage at this time, or at least from the perspective of the family, that's the case. And so they can't. Their options for dealing with this crisis are limited if they wish to spare her any additional harm. So we'll pick up the story with that the proposal has been made: circumcise yourself in the town, and then you can marry her. And in verse 20, Hamor and Shechem are going to propose that to the community. Hamor and Shechem and his son came back to the gate of the city, like we've talked about before. This was the courthouse area, not just the entryway. And they spoke to the men of the city, saying, "These men," meaning the children of Jacob, "are peacefully disposed towards us. Let them settle in the land and travel about in it, for the land is certainly wide-reaching enough for them. Let us take their daughters as wives, and let us give them our daughters. But only on this condition will the men comply with us, to settle among us, to become a single people, that every male among us be circumcised as they are circumcised. Their acquired livestock, their acquired property, and all their animals, will they not then become ours? Let us only comply with them, that they may settle among us." Okay, so Shechem and Hamor, his father, are making the proposal to the people, and they're saying, "Look, these people are nice. I mean, I guess. And we only have to circumcise ourselves, and then we can become like a single people, a unified group." Now, we know that Jacob was very wealthy when he came back from Lavan, and it's clear that that is part of the calculation here. Shechem may believe that he's actually in love with Dinah, although we shouldn't treat people the way we love, the way he treated her. But for the rest of the community, he seems to be trying to persuade them that this will be financially advantageous for the entire community. Because if we get circumcised, then we can become like one, and that means what they have will become ours. Right? It's a very telling line that we will end up with everything they have. Now, there's a very straightforward explanation for this, which is that the people of Shechem, that community, outnumber the people of Jacob. And if Jacob and Shechem become linked, Jacob and his people will become submerged within the greater population of the city. So everything that's brought in will eventually be held primarily by the people of Shechem rather than by the people of Jacob. So he did the math and he worked out, yes, we give them siblings, our children, and they give us children, and we've got more than them. We're going to end up getting everything they want. And you know what? No violence needs to be done. But clearly they were at least tempted by the wealth that Jacob and his family currently owned. All right, verse 24. So they hearkened to Hamor and to Shechem his son, all who go out to war from the gate of his city. All the males were circumcised. All who go out to war from the gate of his city. So you'll notice that Fox is putting in this "go out to war." It's something that he's tried to explain is that this idea of Yotzei Sha'ar, the people who go out from the gate, is a military term, meaning everybody who is of military age. So they weren't necessarily circumcising everybody from infancy. They were circumcising the age of military. On the other hand, this could be prefacing what's going to happen in just a few minutes, which is the counterattack, that everybody might have been actually circumcised. That may have been what they did, but the reader should be aware that especially means that everybody who is capable of fighting was circumcised. So everyone was circumcised, including the people who are capable of fighting, or the people of military age were circumcised. Both are fine readings of the Hebrew, but the upshot is going to be that their fighting force is greatly diminished. And that's very important for verse 25. But on the third day, it was, when they were still hurting, that two of Yaakov's sons, Shimon and Levi, Dinah's full brothers, took each man his sword. They came upon the city secure and killed all the males. And Hamor and Shechem, his son, they killed by the sword. Then they took Dinah from Shechem's house and went off. All right, so on the third day, when apparently it's considered the recovery process from a Brit Milah, the circumcision, is especially painful and incapacitating, especially in the age prior to modern anesthetics and pain relief, that Yaakov's sons, Shimon and Levi, who were also born from Leah, thus making them full brothers, they go through the town and they kill everybody else in the town, kill all the males in the town, I should point out. Thus, the idea that their military age men had all been circumcised is very relevant because it has made them vulnerable. And then they took Dinah from Shem's house. Like I said, she was still there, and they left. Yaakov's other sons, meaning the other children of Yaakov, came upon the corpses and plundered the city because they had defiled their sister. So they weren't involved in the physical attack, but they were involved in the despoiling of the city. Their sheep, their oxen, their donkeys, whatever was inside of the city and out in the field, they took. All their riches, all their little ones, and their wives, they captured and plundered, all as well as all that was in the houses. Okay, so this is Warfare 101 of the ancient world. You kill the men that are capable of fighting, and then you take the loot, and the loot included human prisoners that would then be used as servants, as slaves, and that was sort of the norm. Now, we do find later on that in most of the other incidents of attacks and wars, that this type of plundering is usually avoided. In fact, the term becomes cherem, that things are proscribed, meaning that everything is off limits. If you want to see what happens when that doesn't work out, check the incident of Saul and the Amalekites. And this is a very painful reminder that that was not the norm in the ancient world, that the norm was when you defeated somebody, you took the loot. That was the standard practice. And with that in mind, we then get to our question of, well, was this right? And verse 30 and 31 are going to present the only clear information that the Torah gives us about the morality of this action. Remember, the Torah generally does not provide the modern style omniscient narrator who says, and what they did was wrong or what they did was right. Usually the Torah simply describes it. Occasionally it'll say, and did what was pleasing in the sight of Adonai, or something like that, but it's not a modern, reliable, omniscient narrator who is telling the reader exactly what they should understand. It is leaving a lot of room for interpretation. So let's get what it actually says. Yaakov said to Shimon and Levi, "You have stirred up disaster for me, making me reek among the settled folk of the land, the Canaanites and the Perizzites. For I am minfolk few in number. They will band together against me and strike me, and I will be wiped out, I and my household." So Yaakov seems to be objecting to what just happened because he seems to be worried that this will encourage retaliation, that while the city of Shechem may have been destroyed, there are many other people in the area. The Canaanites and the Perizzites, in broader term, are all around. And if they perceive me as being the kind of person who will destroy a town and take the plunder, then they will be incentivized to do the same to me. whether it be seen as retaliation or whether it be seen as preemptive defense. We are not going to be welcome. And he is recognizing that they are outnumbered. Yes, through guile and strategy, they were able to overpower this city, but that trick is not going to work again. And that means that they are now vulnerable to counterattack by other Canaanite groups, and he is desperately worried. Now, it is not making it clear whether or not he thought that something needed to be done. He's not making it clear whether or not he felt that their actions were just in a general sense, that had they had the military might to not be worried about retaliation, that of course he would have agreed with this. He seems to be only focusing explicitly on the fact that this is likely to cause more suffering, more murder, and more destruction. If he had been asked beforehand, he would have counseled no, not because he didn't value his daughter, but because he valued the entirety of his family, and he was worried that trying to save her in this way would lead to the destruction of all of them. Okay, so that's the explicit information that we have, but more will need to be said on that, especially in light of the brothers' retort. But they said, should our sister then be treated like a whore? So this phrase, kizona, like a whore, like a harlot, choose your word as you wish, is something that needs more explanation, as we're going to see in our commentary. Because in what way was she being treated like a whore? She was not given money for the right of being intimate with him. She didn't stand on the side of the road and take fees for intimacy. And can a person be treated like a whore? What does that mean? Isn't it as the old saying says, the oldest profession? Isn't it always a contractual agreement? Wouldn't rape, by definition, be the antithesis of prostitution? Since there is no reciprocal relationship, it is purely abusive. Or are they saying that her being married would have been akin to treating her like a whore? Those are some of the more surface level understandings here, but as you can see, it's not entirely clear what they mean by this statement. It is perhaps in the modern reader's mind something that just gets hand-waved away as a euphemism for insultingly. Should our sister be treated insultingly? But the Torah doesn't usually record flippant remarks. It is carefully constructed to make sure that there is more to be learned by each word than just they were angry. And indeed, if they had just been angry and just been upset in a generic way, that's what the verse would have said. So we are going to have to wrestle with this. Before we jump into that, are there any questions either on the Zoom or on YouTube? Not seeing anybody unmuting or typing in chat. So let's go ahead and dive into our commentary. So we're going to start with Or HaChaim, with what was Yaakov's position. Yaakov said, this is his retort, Yaakov had thought that they intended to rescue Dinah with their subterfuge, and perhaps kill Shem as well, not to slaughter the entire city. So Or HaChaim is of the opinion that Yaakov knew something was up, but what he misjudged was the extent of their plan, that they were going to go in, they would rescue Dinah, and then they would get away, and that way, this was a way of bypassing the greater defenses of the town. A simple sort of explanation. However, beginning with Ibn Ezra here and then the others, we can look and see, well, was that really their plan? What were they actually motivated to do? Was it purely just a rescue plan, or was there a larger consideration? So beginning with Ibn Ezra, should one deal with our sister as with a harlot? That is to say, should Shem deal with our sister as with a harlot? Now, you may be wondering, why is Ibn Ezra rendering the translation as commentary? Well, that's because if we go back to our actual phrase, it is a little awkward in the Hebrew. Who is the ya'aseh here? Who is doing the action to our sister? Like a prostitute, he will make of our sister. It's a very awkward grammatical construction, and so we have the translation here based upon commentary like Ibn Ezra's. So sometimes you will find this where the commentary sounds like the way the translation reads. That's because the translation has read the commentary and decided that's probably the best way to render it into simple English. So this happens not just with Ibn Ezra, but a lot of commentaries will sometimes have this. But we still have to deal with our main question, which is, what does it mean? Should she be treated like a harlot? What was their question truly? Is Shem to be allowed to treat our sister as if she were a harlot, and we should not avenge the shame she was subjected to? All right, so Radak begins to move us forward. So there is a shamefulness that happens when a woman is treated like a harlot, and their intention with their actions was to avenge that this was retaliatory. This was not just a rescue operation, and meaning that if they could simply get Dina and get her out without having exacted any punishment for her treatment, they would not have done so. They would have still exacted punishment on top of her rescue. So Radak is emphasizing here that there was a crime being committed and a shameful behavior that was calling out for recompense. And indeed, Rashi is going to not exactly echo this, but put a slightly different spin on it that I think is critical. Like a harlot implies as one unprotected. So Rashi is really trying to drive home that no, it isn't that she was treated like a prostitute in the sense of the business transaction. It was she was treated like a prostitute because prostitute is a stand-in word for somebody that has no protection, somebody that is ultimately categorically vulnerable. That is somebody that is taken advantage of. Doesn't focus on the business relationship. It focuses on the fact that when somebody chooses to harm a prostitute, that person is not protected by the community or even by the family. And thus the brothers needed to act to prove that she was not unprotected. Indeed, there was protection for her. It was called her brothers. And to go on to help make us understand this clearer, he brings the Targum, which is the Aramaic translation of the Torah, to show, indeed, this is how we should render this sentence. So the Targum renders it as an accusative, that's a type of verb form, so that the meaning is, should one be permitted to make our sister become as a woman who has no one to protect her? So obviously that is an expansive understanding of the text, but that is not unreasonable. Consider the fact that oftentimes words are used in a cultural sense that is expected to be understood by the reader, but 3,000 years later, it might not be so easily rendered. So, for example, if someone says he was treating his workers like a dog, if somebody is not familiar with at least English culture, maybe some Western culture would also parallel this. What do you mean like a dog? I mean, after all, in the modern world, many people treat their dogs very, very well. Does that mean that they were giving them fine food and taking them to get medical care, like many people do for their pets? No, the phrase treat like a dog doesn't mean that they considered them to be canine, and it doesn't mean that they treated them like a pet. It means that they treated them as the lowest rank on the society ladder, that they were treated as though they were subhuman. But you only know that, excuse me again, you only know that because you are immersed within the culture that has that as a phrase. Rashi is arguing here, and the Targum's translation is supporting him, that in the culture of the time, to be treated like a prostitute means to be treated as someone for whom there is no thought that they will be protected, and thus you can do with them as you wish. The actual sexual aspect of prostitution was a very minor consideration with the use of this term. It was the lack of protection. Again, going back into ancient and classical, really all the way up into just the pre-modern period, whether or not somebody would come to your defense was a huge factor in most people's quality of life. If you had no family, were an orphan, were a widow, you were often more vulnerable to exploitation and abuse, because the centralization of authority and protection that we experience within the modern world was not prevalent, or was severely limited by geography, resources, and other things. So you needed others to protect you, not just the government, not just the police. Indeed, there was no modern style police force until the modern world. So this is really speaking much more to the vulnerability of their sister rather than the particular act that was done to her. And Sifei Chachamim, which is a super commentary on Rashi, tries to explain this in even more detail. What do we mean by unprotected? Why is Rashi mentioning this at all? Rashi is answering the question, only a woman who willingly abandons herself to relations with any man is called a harlot. If so, how could Shem possibly make her a harlot when she did not willingly abandon herself, like we were talking about initially? Thus, Rashi explains, abandon. Shem acted as if she was abandoned. It wasn't that he made her into be a harlot, because you cannot. It has to be a mutually agreed upon activity, and this certainly was not. Thus, it has to mean that Shem was treating her in a way that was as though she were a harlot, with the important aspect being not the harlotry, but the lack of protection, that she was abandoned, that there was no one on her side. And of course, Shimon and Levi are proving there are people on her side, namely her brothers, and they are going to defend her from this type of behavior. Let me just double check our YouTube folks. Okay, we're good. All right, so now we're going to begin a sort of extended breakdown through Or HaChaim, who often likes to unravel these quandaries in more detail, and usually brings in other insights that other commentaries might have made, but perhaps without as much explicit discussion. They said, again, this is Shimon and Levi, should we have let him treat our sister like a harlot? We need to understand how such a reply could have had any bearing on Jacob's concern for the survival of his family in a possible confrontation with the other Amorites in the region. All right, so as a beautiful commentary, he is trying to explain, look, Jacob said, what have you done? Now they're going to kill us all. And they responded, should we let him treat her like that? That doesn't tell me that we are safe from being wiped out by the other people. Amorites is another synonym for the Canaanites in the area. So what are they trying to say? How is this a defense? Now, again, modern reader, we are used to authors just putting in emotional retorts that are absolutely illogical and do not have any real bearing on the subject, but are just being said because they're just being said. The Torah, on the other hand, avoids such types of emotional outbursts that are illogical or incapable of connecting to the underlying message. And so we start with the assumption that their response made sense to Jacob's actual concern of, we're all going to get killed now. And should they treat her like that, doesn't actually work. Again, I know to a modern ear, it sounds perfectly sensible, in the sense of believable, to have two people arguing, they're going to kill us all. Well, we couldn't just stand by. That sounds like something that would be in a modern movie or fiction very easily. Indeed, it sounds like a common argument that people might be having where they're not actually listening to each other. One has the concern for the entire family, and one has the concern just for the sister at the moment. And they are talking past each other. But the Torah is assumed not to be mirroring the major problems in modern conversation. And instead, the brother's response has to be dealing also with Jacob's concern. Not exclusively, they can be adding much to it, but it needs to be a reasonable response to Jacob. So let's continue this question of why this would be the topic at hand, and what Jacob meant and what they mean, and how such a reply could even be useful. Because in addition to the general things that I've described, after all, Jewish law provides that if the surrender of a specific individual is demanded by enemy forces as a condition to save the lives of the remaining prisoners, then such an individual must be surrendered in order to save the lives of all the people who this individual is part of. So that means that if we have 100 people and the enemy comes up to the gates of the town and they say, we want John Smith, and we all look and there's John Smith standing there, Halakha says we are allowed to hand over John Smith and not have the other 99 people be murdered. But that is a legal action. Now, just to point out, if they say, give us one of you and we'll let the rest of you go, we are not allowed to pick one and hand them over. Because at such point we are becoming the instrument of selection and thus of the crime. We are allowed to comply with their demand, but we are not allowed to create the demand by choosing the person ourselves. It's a much longer conversation and horrible situations to be put into. But what Or HaChaim is trying to point out here is that, technically, if they say, let us keep Dinah and we'll let the rest of you live, that is not that is a halakhically permissible agreement to make, not one that we would want to make, not one that we should look forward to making, one that we should look for every possible reason to avoid. But it is conceivable and permissible under the worst of possible conditions to say, all right, keep her, and that way the rest of us won't get murdered. So again, Jacob is saying, what you've done is going to bring them down on all of us. And they're saying, what? That she shouldn't be treated like a harlot? That doesn't seem to be assuaging that problem. I mean, yes, actually, there is no requirement for all the people to become martyrs, even if the alternative is the commission of a serious crime of incest or other sexual crime. Seeing that this is so before such a sin has been committed, it is all the more so after the crime has already been committed and cannot be reversed. So if they say, give us person A so that we can be intimate with them, technically we are allowed to hand them over to save the remaining people in the community. And if they've already committed the crime, says Or HaChaim, then all the more so are you trying to get us all killed to what? Undo the crime that's already been committed? The crime's already been committed. What are you achieving here? So their response doesn't seem to make sense, says Or HaChaim. Therefore, we have to try and understand it more broadly. Perhaps the brothers merely wanted to calm the fears of their father, saying that a confrontation with the Amorites would be a real danger only if they had killed the people of Shechem without an adequate reason. Under the circumstances, when kidnapping and rape had been committed, they did not think the other Amorites would raise much of a fuss. So, explanation number one of how should she be treated like that as a response to they're going to kill us all is they're not going to kill us all because look how they treated her. Even the Amorites, the other Canaanites, will recognize that we had a legitimate grievance to fight back in this case. That even the other Canaanites wouldn't say, how dare you fight in order to rescue your sister? They would understand that they would do the same under those circumstances. And thus, the actual triggering event is a rebuttal to, a rebuttal to, I'm afraid they're going to attack us. They're not going to attack us because the triggering event means that even under their rather shoddy system of justice, they'll recognize the rightness of what we did, and that means we won't be in trouble. So that's explanation number one, says Or HaChaim, of what the brothers might be thinking by their response. Explanation number two, it is also possible that the brothers considered their actions as one that would serve notice on the Amorites not to take liberties with their family. Having seen what happened to an individual who used violence against a member of Jacob's family, the Amorites would take this to heart and be forewarned of the consequences of such deeds in the future. So, explanation number one was, this is justice, and even the other Canaanites will recognize it as such. Explanation number two is, this is a deterrent, that if we didn't do this, then we would be inviting the Amorites to take more advantage of our family. That we live in the land of Canaan now, Dad, and these people are terrible people. We see many examples of this throughout the book of Genesis. And if we're going to live here, we have to make sure that they are afraid of us, that they are aware of how well we can fight back for ourselves. And that will not only mean we can fight back when needed, but it will encourage them not to commit violence in the first place, because they will be afraid of us. So yes, Dad, you may be afraid of them, but if you had done nothing, your fears would have been multiplied. There isn't a, if we just accept it and don't fight back, everything will be okay. That is inviting more danger rather than preventing danger. Now, you may hear in both of these discussions many echoes for modern situations, in particular the current war in Israel. Many people will say that, retaliation is only breeding more violence, that retaliation is only going to create more antagonism. Yet we also know from modern history that if Israel doesn't retaliate, if Israel doesn't go back and try to rescue the hostages and prevent additional attacks in the most extreme manner, then in a way that also invites additional attacks. Peacefully absorbing the violence committed against Israel by other countries doesn't diminish the amount of violence that will be committed. It instead encourages additional violence. It's painful. Certainly Israel doesn't want to be committing violence even in retaliation, but this text would be telling us that sometimes the violence is needed not only for the justice that's needed, but is also needed in order to prevent further injustices in the future. All right. Now, Pekeda Rabbi Eliezer, one of the older Midrash collections, is going to draw in a pattern of verses that will help us weave a story with a little bit more depth. So, it begins with a passage taken from Amos, the prophet Amos, or went into the house and leaned his hand on the wall, and the serpent bit him. Now, this is a fairly interesting verse in context, but they are taking it as sort of an open line and are going to interpret it. When Jacob went into his house in the land of Canaan, the serpent bit him. All right, what do we mean? And remember, Jacob is often used not just to describe the person himself, but the nation of Israel, since his name eventually becomes Israel. Who was the serpent? This was Shem. All right, so the serpent bit him, Shem bit him, Jacob was harmed when he was bitten. What harm was it? Well, because Dinah was abiding in the tents and she did not go into the street, what did Shem do? He brought dancing girls who were playing on pipes in the streets. Dinah went out to see those girls who were making merry, and he seized her and he slept with her, and she conceived and bore Asnat. Now, there's more to be said about the idea of Asnat, who eventually ends up in Egypt as well, but that is a whole nother midrashic chain that we don't have time for today. But the idea here is that this was not just a casual attack. This was a premeditated attack. That since Dinah was safely in her home and with her family, Shem actually couldn't get to her. She was protected, but he deliberately set a parade out such that she would feel safe coming out, since it looked like there were only women there, and then he could spring on her and attack her. Now, that's the description of the deed. What about the retaliation? Shimon and Levi were moved by a great zeal on account of the immorality. As it is said, they said, should he deal with our sister as with a harlot? And each man took a sword and slew all the men of Shechem. When Jacob heard thereof, he became sorely afraid. Now all the people of the land will hear, and they will gather against me and smite me. He began to curse the wrath of his sons. As it is said, from Genesis 49, cursed be their anger, for it is fierce. And he also cursed their sword. Weapons of violence are their swords. All the kings of the earth heard and feared very much, saying, if two sons of Jacob have done all these great things, if they all band together themselves together, they will be able to destroy the world. And the dread of the Holy One, blessed be he, fell upon them, as it is said, and the terror of God was upon the cities, and they did not pursue after the sons of Jacob. So it does work out that they are not retaliated against, and it is because they are afraid, as we see in Genesis 35, the next chapter. And the argument that Pirkei the Rebbe Eliezer is making is that that was because specifically just two brothers went and did this. That Jacob might have been afraid, but he did not yet calculate just exactly the effect that this would have in the retelling to the rest of the nations. That whereas he saw it as, I am weak, I am vulnerable. Indeed, he had spent most of his life feeling weak and vulnerable to his brother Esau and to his father-in-law Lavan. It is sort of the way he has approached much of life. Then so too, he expected that to continue as a pattern here in this situation. His sons, on the other hand, have a very different view. They recognize that they can stand up for themselves, that they are a match for these others under the right circumstances and with God's assistance, and that in fact this will terrify the other nations into avoiding confrontation with them. And indeed, that does seem to have been the case. They are, it seems, vindicated that when they left, they were able to do so peacefully, that the other city-states in the area did not harass them despite what they had done to Shechem. Any questions or comments so far? Okay, so we're going to finish off with Sforno. That time I just poured the tea down the wrong pipe. As sort of a summary of many of the different themes that we have been touching on. Only a harlot does not have anyone standing up in her defense, like Rashi talked about, avenging violence done to her. It is incumbent upon us to avenge her disgrace, says Shimon and Levi. Once the inhabitants of the region will understand this, they will have no reason to attack us. So again, going back to Or HaChaim's first explanation, that what we are doing is just. We cannot make it look like there is no one to defend her, which is the second explanation, because if they know that the people will be defended, then they won't attack us. And we are right to do it in any case, and they will recognize the rightness of this. Now, are they right in their analysis of the situation? Well, that's very difficult to understand. Going all the way back to our first opinion from Or HaChaim about Jacob expected them to only rescue Dinah and kill Shem, we are still left with the question of whether or not the attack on the entire city was the best solution, or whether or not the brothers should have only killed Shem and rescued Dinah herself. Now, it is very difficult to say that that would have been possible. If they had been able to kill Shem and rescue Dinah, they would have. We clearly can guess that. But it seems to be fairly clear that they were unable to just walk into the city, kill the son of the king, basically, and then walk away. And so they had to come up with a subterfuge. Did that mean that additional people were killed that were not directly involved in the activity? It does appear so. Now, there is a long-standing debate, something I discussed a few weeks ago in one of my Friday night sermons, about whether or not this would count as acceptable or unacceptable collateral damage, about whether or not the people of Shechem should be considered as enemy combatants because they were not prosecuting Shechem under the general rules of justice and saying, look, we don't want him to rape a stranger. We don't want him to rape our own people. This is wrong, and he should be properly prosecuted for his behavior. The fact that they did not do so, that they failed to do so, that they were not going to hand him over to Jacob's family for punishment, that they were still willing to let him keep Dinah in their town, shows that they were at least complicit, even if they weren't as guilty of the crime directly. And thus, removing them in order to rescue Dinah would seem appropriate. On the other hand, they may have been equally held hostage by Shechem and his father. They may not have felt that they had a chance to successfully or safely protest against Shechem, and thus they too were captives of the leadership of the town and did not deserve to be killed. At the end of the day, it is never going to be a clear-cut situation. We will never be able to stop and analyze the motivations and the support that each individual has as part of a warring country before we engage in the necessary paths of war. And this is, of course, why we seek to avoid war at all costs. But we do recognize that one of those costs that cannot be avoided is the inviting of additional conflict. And this is something that Israel in particular, but all of us should always be considering, that sometimes being pacifistic invites additional attacks rather than deters them. And those additional attacks will demand a stronger retaliation, which in the final analysis will lead to greater slaughter on both sides than if the retaliation had happened initially. So it is not easy, and anyone who pretends like these types of topics are easy is fooling themselves and fooling others. We can do the best we can. We can be sure to make it clear that no one is abandoned, that all are held dear, and that all will be protected to the best of our ability, and that anybody who transgresses will face those consequences, while at the same time also trying to minimize the accidental killing of those that are perhaps not as directly involved in the crime. But that is never going to be as simple as even that complicated paragraph was. It is always going to have problems in the performance of those things. That is why, again, we seek to avoid them, and we pray that more and more of the people of the world will come to recognize that such attacks as Shechem perpetrated are the beginnings of great suffering for all. And if we can avoid those deeds, then we can avoid those escalations as well. With that, I will leave it there for today. A reminder that tonight I do have my We Need to Talk class in person. My apologies to those of you who are only able to live stream my classes, but some conversations are best handled in person. So if you're able to come, I look forward to hearing from you. And if not, we do that every week, 7 o'clock at our library, and would love to have you drop by whenever you can make it. Have a good day, everyone, and be well.